Welcome, my friend, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. Today is hopefully the start of a new series that we are dubbing Philosophical Friday, or I'm dubbing it, and we'll see if the name catches on like wildfire. Uh, the purpose of the show is to dive into some of the philosophical questions of poker and two major things that I like about Philosophical Friday is, I'm a big fan of alliteration. I think first and foremost, this is the driver of everything I do. Tactical Tuesday, Philosophical Friday, and secondarily, getting the opportunity to create some content and do some podcasts with Duncan, the UCLA math professor. He's been on the show. I have had many conversations with him off air as well. He's just a massive resource to the poker community at large. Duncan, welcome back to Chasing Poker Greatness, sir.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great having you. And as I said, I had to ask you just a few moments ago, like, have you been on the show once or twice? Because I forgot. We've probably had 10 meetings over the past year privately, just discussing some projects that I was working on. I had shockingly, some math questions, and I needed an expert to help me out with. And we've talked about you wanted to join the Villager Royale, which went down like a year ago. And then that project sort of fizzled out after I realized how much energy it took cutting and splicing a bunch of different things together. So could you tell me, I guess let's first talk about the origin of this project, how it came together and why we felt it was something worthy of putting out into the world.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what I usually tell my wife when it's her birthday. We one of the ways I like to approach birthdays is that I want to treat birthdays as every other day, and every other day as if it's my birthday, basically. So I tell my wife happy birthday, like probably like I don't know, like 200 days a year. Just I have that approach. So I guess what I'm trying to say is what you were saying earlier when we had all these conversations, and it feels that the podcast is like an everyday conversation, and also an everyday conversation could be like a podcast. And of course, I mean, it's all it's relative. Some people may like it, some people may not. I'm not just saying that like all of our conversations are worthy for people to spend their time, but at least it feels to me that it there's so many things going on when we're having these private conversations. We might as well put it out there and then let people decide whether they find that interesting or not. And another thing is that we're talking about poker, but as we're digging deeper and deeper, it sort of feels like there's other things lying underneath, right? I mean, there's some more important things that we can discuss, and I don't want to talk about that today, but often one thing that comes up in our conversation is truth, and how truth is defined and how many times there are disagreements with people. And I thought that would be at least something worth discussing. Try to do our best to shed both sides of the argument to the greatest light possible. And we shouldn't dig that we shouldn't dig that deeply today, but that's what one topic, and several other things too. How people perceive games, that would be another thing. Or GTO, what exactly is GTO, the philosophy behind it, why people like it so much, and things like that, which I think we can maybe talk a little bit about later today. But
Yeah.
that's the origin, basically, that treat every day as a special day, and every special day as every other day. That's how I would summarize it.
Well, that's very well said. And today we are going to speak about GTO philosophically, and I know that many people in the village have asked kind of philosophical questions just over time, things along the lines of when does a professional poker player, like, what do they do with their money? Like, do they just always save their money for their bankroll? Do they spend their money? And at what point do they start spending their money? Just these sort of questions about being a professional poker player. And yeah, I think they're interesting and worthy of discussion. And if anybody's listening to this right now that thinks that has a question that they feel would be a great topic for the show, feel free to send me an email, brad@chasingpokergreatness.com, or a message in Greatness Village. Post it in any of the channels or send me a direct message, whichever. And yeah, that would be very helpful to find topics to discuss and also learn, what you're interested in about learning more about.
Absolutely. And Brad, since you mentioned it, some of these questions, as they pertain to finance or investing in general and how, poker players deal with their money, let us know also if this is a topic you're interested in. Personally, I'm very much interested in this kind of questions. How can one, build wealth using poker as a source? And, we can discuss ideas and things like that. So let us know if that's something you're interested in.
Yeah, and I have some actual philosophical questions as well, that are just kind of coming to me that I think would be great, just great topics to discuss later on down the road as it relates to, poker coaching and poker training and all of these sorts of things. Cool. So with that said, I think we've done a decent enough job introducing Philosophical Friday. And so stick around after the break here, and we're going to dive into the first topic, which is GTO. What is GTO? Is balancing the same as GTO? These sorts of questions. So stick around, and me and Duncan are going to do a deep dive into game theory optimal. All right, welcome back to Philosophical Friday with Coach Brad Wilson and Duncan Palamortis. And Duncan's topic today is GTO. So, since this is a realm that you have thought quite a bit about, and in your first episode on CPG, one of the things that I recognize very quickly when as you are writing your book, and you can discuss your book as well, how figuring out like what poker is and breaking it down from like a base foundational concept is just like a lot of work and very, very challenging. So yeah, just we'll transition now to talk about what you learned when you were writing your book, and then about GTO.
For sure. Yeah. One thing that I want to say, and I think is very relevant to GTO, is that, which incidentally, we should probably also define for, the 1% of our viewers who may not know what it stands for, game
Sure.
theory optimal. And we will talk about that a little bit. But game theory optimal, I should repeat it one more time. The one thing that I soon realized is that noise reduction, i.e. the idea of basically trying to create the basics of an otherwise complicated idea is actually very difficult. Einstein used to say, you should make something as simple as possible, but no simpler than that. So do not oversimplify things, right? And this is actually incredibly difficult. So try to, get poker down to its bare minimums. It's actually incredibly hard. At least it is for me. It might be easier for other people. I should speak for myself. And GTO is no different, because essentially there is this very interesting realm where the people who usually avoid using GTO, they're coming into two widely different groups. So there's those people who actually do not understand it. They do not understand how it works. They do not understand how it does. They do not understand how to use it. And then those people who avoid it exactly for those reasons, because they understand how it works. They understand how to use it. They understand how it does. And for that reason, they avoid it. So what is it that GTO does, and why is there that discrepancy even for those who do not necessarily use it? And I tried to, and this is an example you actually use yourself, the rock paper scissors example. And why don't we start there? Why don't we start by what is GTO, and in your own simple words, what is your GTO, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, and so it's funny. I don't know why that happened, by the way. Like why when you're writing why Alex beats Bobby at poker, that metaphor that you use is like the same one that kind of came to me of, you're playing rock paper scissors against another human being, and like GTO, so game theory optimal just means that a strategy that is not exploitable, right? It's just like a strong strategy that the person can't just beat. or they can't beat. And in rock paper scissors, GTO strategy is just randomizing every single action that you take, and by randomizing every single action that you take, because there's no option you can choose that is superior to the other options, that will, you just have a strategy that's unbeatable. And by unbeatable, I mean, they're not going to beat you more than 50% of the time over infinity, right?
That's right.
And so that's GTO. Assuming that you're playing against somebody else that is also playing GTO, which is sort of the first assumption that goes into figuring out what the game theory optimal strategy ought to be.
Correct, and to add a little bit here to that is that a common misconception is that people think that GTO is the most profitable strategy, right? So a lot of people think that GTO maximizes profits. In actuality, it does the opposite. It is a highly risk averse strategy that locks in profits without taking an extra risk to increase that amount. So it kind of like locks in. I think that will be the phrase to remember. It locks in profit. So if somebody says,
yeah,
go ahead.
can I dive into that extra risk? Because I think it's important to define what that extra risk is, right? And the extra risk is that somebody recognizes the hole in your strategy and takes advantage of it, which is, basically known as an exploit.
Correct. That's exactly correct. So again, if we were to give that in a metaphor, in a very, very crude metaphor, and we're going to use like very, very small amounts of money. So just to keep it very simple. So let's say that you have an opportunity, that there's a pot, there's $10 in the middle. You have an opportunity to lock in, let's say we're heads up, you have an opportunity to lock in $5 of those dollars. So you say, you know what, I want my $5. I don't want any dollar more than that. I just want to lock in the $5. And GTO guarantees me at least that. If my opponent makes mistakes, maybe I'm going to get a little bit more than 5, maybe not, depending on how my opponent plays. It's no longer up to me. I lock in those 5 out of $10, and that's it. That's what I'm going to get. Now, in the other example where the extra risk, as we say, exactly as you described it, you go for, instead of $5, you go for $7, let's say, out of 10, with a small window of exploitation. If your opponent is incredibly sophisticated, often if your opponent is as good as a computer, maybe they can see through it, and instead of us getting $7, we ended up getting 3. So there is this risk, extra risk, although understanding what that risk is, I think, is incredibly important. And it's an important piece of information, which I spent like an entire chapter talking about that risk, that it's actually not as big as people think. And it often requires, a computer to start, cold calling 4 bets out of position with hands like 3-5 suited and things like that, which, no human who's not tilting is usually making plays like that.
Yeah. And okay, so I think that answers the first question here of what is GTO.
Right.
And the next question that we have is balancing the same as GTO. So constructing, a balanced range, which again, to define it would be you have the same number of bluffs or lower equity hands as you have higher equity hands within the strategy that you're creating.
Right. I would say personally, I would say no. To be fair, and maybe we can do a little bit of a still manning of that argument. The balancing is a precursor to game theory optimal. I would say the difference between balancing, which again, like you said, is essentially splitting between doing a certain thing and also doing the opposite to kind of throw your opponent off, is exactly that. It's sort of like a defensive mechanism that prevents our opponents from having a pretty solid understanding of how our game works. And like the typical example I usually give is bluffing. If you go and you play, like, let's say, those of you who go and play live games, you can soon realize that you don't really need to bluff people unless they start folding too much to your value bets, right? So I've been in games where nobody would ever fold ever, right? And in that situation, why not just like take a value hand and send everybody to value town, raise before the flop, bet big on the flop, bet on the turn, and bet on the river. So in some sense, Bluffing is a safety net, a defensive mechanism when the value bets no longer work, right? So when you bet a player and all of a sudden you see, you know what, my bets, my value bets are not getting called. So maybe, you know, I'm too tight. Maybe I'm perceived as too needy. So maybe I need to throw in some bluffs. To me, that's balancing. You know, that you throw in different types of bets together with your normative type of bets, so that you can confuse the opponent. The reason why this is different than GTO is that it's not necessarily at the correct proportions, right? I mean, because GTO actually will give you the exact percentages that you need to do things like that. So it's more of like a, I guess we can call it like a poor man's GTO, which is also a human's GTO, I would say.
Yeah, it's a strategy that's constructed with biases. And so one thing that's quite problematic is that while the feedback that you get at the poker table is something, it is not much of anything. And that's sort of like a major problem that human beings face. And you know, you described it very simply there of like, oh, my value bets are not getting called, so now I need to start bluffing more, right? But you don't actually know that they have a hand that's worthy of calling the value bet in the first place. So you get feedback that villain's folding, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you should alter your strategy fundamentally, because you just don't have enough information to work with, which is sort of like, you know, it's a thing of like, I had my associate coach Shu on the podcast recently, and he talked about the first time he played live poker, and you know, he folded like the first 6 hands, and he was like, okay, like I've built my image now. I folded 6 hands, so now I'm just gonna like play this whatever hand I get dealt the next time, right? Because like he assumed that just because he had folded a little bit, now he got to play a hand by, you know, using that fold juice up, or however you want to describe it. So you do have to be careful about the feedback that you're getting when you're playing poker, because it's not always on point. It's not always something that's, should determine your strategy kind of one way or the other. And I guess there's a natural question here too. You mentioned that balancing is not the same to you as GTO. And I would say that's an interesting place to go, is like, where does GTO strategy even come from? Like, where does it just come from, like the poker gods sending it down to our computer that says, oh, this is like what you should do in this situation? So like, let's dive into that a little bit of like, where does GTO even come from?
Absolutely. And before we get to that, I just want to point out that the comment that you mentioned earlier is exactly spot on. It's exactly the type of nuance that one needs to put into the discussion when we're talking about the subjects, right? So essentially what you're saying, and you're absolutely correct, this was an example of simplification that, if not treated carefully, it may easily lead to an oversimplification. You're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And
let me, sorry to interrupt, but something just came to me as like a metaphor. So basically, if we go back to the rock, paper, scissors example, right? Say the exploit is knowing that the person you play against, or seeing them play 10 times, they've chosen rock 80% of the time, right? So then the exploit is not to randomize, but to choose paper every time, right? However, because we are humans and we are biased and we don't understand randomness quite very well, it is possible that human is randomizing and just threw rock 8 out of 10 times, which means we shouldn't change our strategy, because the information that we have is not worthy. It's not worth anything. So anyway, just wanted to add
no, this is beautiful. This is beautiful because, again, it puts a very important hole in the theory of when to adjust, right? So, and I need to be very, very careful, and I love that. Like, I need to be careful when I say these things, and I try to make that point clear in the book too. When I say things like, you know, we're sitting at a table, we see an opponent and they do X, therefore we should do Y. Really, this is not what I really mean, right? This is the easiest way to create a picture. But really, what I mean is that if we have enough evidence, that evidence can actually be through population tendencies, that evidence could be through databases, that certain games we play, the opponents react in a certain way, then we know that the strategy we started with maybe a couple of years ago is no longer functional. Right? Of course, that's a mouthful, right? I mean, that's very difficult for someone to actually have a picture like that. So to actually answer your question, which I think is actually very relevant to how we can approach those things, You're absolutely correct. If somebody, 8 times out of 10, they start with rock, that's not enough evidence of anything. However, if we actually go ahead and we interview, and by interview, I mean we take a database essentially of 1,000 people playing that game, and we see that we have an 80% rock, then we know that we have a sample of significance, right? And actually mathematicians, it's interesting that you mentioned that, they have a cutoff, right? I mean, when they're dealing with, they have fancy names for this. They call them bell curves, and they call them like, T distributions, and they have all these fancy names. But essentially what they're saying is that if your sample size is small, you cannot trust what you see. And it essentially comes down to this. So all of these adjustments, they really are meta adjustments. They're not really adjustments real time. They're meta adjustments to something that we were doing in the past over a long sample. It didn't work over a long sample, and we meta adjusting in the present or in the future. Of course, saying it like that, everybody would be completely lost. But by poking the proper holes, as you should, then we have, I think, the better conversation. And this is like, there's an entire book. I've mentioned the works of Nassim Nicholas Taleb before in our conversations, but there's an entire book he wrote, Fooled by Randomness, which I think that every poker player should at some point read, because the idea that randomness is so difficult for humans to comprehend. It's often impossible to know if something is random or not random in the short run.
I mean, this is why even in the year 2022, there are plenty of people that believe that online poker platforms are rigged based on some sort of arbitrary distribution that they've noticed.
Right.
For some reason, they're like, "Oh, this just like never happens," or the odds of this happening are like whatever they will say. And I mean, there are plenty of counter arguments to that. That I don't know if they're worthy of going into, but incentives is like the major one. But
Absolutely.
another one is like, what are the odds of like you getting 2 cards and a board coming out at exactly the cards that it comes out? It's quite low. However, it must happen, right? It's a thing that like must happen, and so there it is. But yeah, it's incredibly difficult to be random. It's not intuitive. There's another book, Rock Break Scissors, that I love and recommend to all of my students, and understanding just how flawed we are at being random as human beings, which is another reason why you need some sort of, like, if you are going to be applying GTO strategies, you need some sort of foolproof random number generator or an approximation of one that you can use in real time. I know that lots of top level pros will shuffle their chips and use that, or there's like random.org, you can use that as well. But like they do that because they can't trust themselves in figuring out frequencies, like, because human beings, again, we're biased, and we're not going to actually be random when we do try to do it.
Right. And I don't know, like, have I told you that anecdotal story about I think it was Robert Fisher, who he was trying to analyze the results of the local roulette, because he had a theory, a probabilistic theory, and he was using the results of the local casino from the roulette that they used to post every Sunday night. That was back in the day, like several decades ago. Have I told you that story? No. So do you want to hear it?
Yeah. I mean, okay. we can't like tee that up for the listener and then not tell the story. We need the story.
Excuse me. Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's actually a weird one. So he's a very well-known statistician, and he had a theory. We're not going to go into the details of the theory, but it's a very interesting statistical theory. And then he wanted to test his theory by random data. So what other source could he use? Like, the easiest source, he could go into the newspaper and see the results of last weekend's data from the roulette. So he thought to himself, okay, excellent source of data. Let's analyze it. So week after week after week, he analyzes the data. And he says, there's something wrong with my mathematical calculations, or there's something wrong with the data, because I mean, if these are random data, like, my theory is wrong. And if these are not random data, maybe my theory is correct, but I will not know. So he went into the newspaper. To make a long story short, the journalists confessed. They were like, oh man, we were so lazy to go down to the casino and record every number. So they made up the numbers. They actually made up the numbers. And you know what happens when humans make up the numbers? The
There's a pattern.
distribution,
Yeah.
there's a pattern, exactly. The distribution is no longer random, so the results are incredibly biased. So his theory, based on that data, was wrong. But actually, when he did it with actually real data, his theory actually was not wrong. It was actually one of the most brilliant theories I guess created. And the thing is that mathematically, when something is random, we can predict the level of, if you will, of canonicity that comes out from specific numbers, right? Or for specific random number generators.
You're going to have to define the term canonicity.
Right, exactly. So basically, it was vague on purpose here because essentially mathematicians can ask how, like, let me give you a very simple example. How often will I see, let's say, 5 reds in a row, right? On a sample of 100. And actually mathematicians can actually do that because they will first tell you how often you can find it on a sample of 5. Let's say these are essentially coin flips. That'll be about like 1 out of 30, 32, something like that. And then if you do it like over a sample of 100, you can somehow, there's a way you can actually append all of these numbers in a nice mathematical way. And just fun fact, I tried to do some calculations myself. How many times you need to get to see somebody getting aces in a row, pocket aces in a row, to start thinking that the game might be rigged. And I actually did a poll on that, and most people thought it was about 3 times. But I did the calculations, and what would you think? Like just out of curiosity, I mean, humans were not wired to deal with those numbers. I mean, I was way off with my guess. But like, how many times you need to see aces in a row so that you can say, you know what, with like almost like 99.99999 confidence that you're being cheated? That's
wow.
a very difficult question.
It is a difficult question, and I have to answer it without really thinking about it.
Right, that's probably best. Yeah,
I would say in live poker, I guess it doesn't really matter in what format of poker since it's just numbers.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, maybe the assumption in live poker is not necessarily being cheated, but maybe there's something wrong with the shuffler, or something. Yeah, something that we can. Yeah,
I would say like, I don't know. I would say 5. Maybe?
Wow, that's perfect. Yeah, that's spot on. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, wow, that's exactly right. 5. Like if you did 5 in a row, I believe I did some calculations, and like within I don't know, like the last 10 years or so, I forget the exact details. There were that happened somewhere in the world, a couple of times or something like that. So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility given how many games are being played. But then when we get to more than that, we start like hitting numbers which are a little bit extravagant to expect that they will happen in real life. But
yeah, well, 99.99 is not 100.
That's true.
It's always important to bear in mind too.
Yeah,
let's so lucky guess on my part.
Good, that's excellent guess.
Let's go back to the topic of GTO, because I feel as if we've gone somewhere off on a tangent. Don't judge us, CPG listener right now. We're just finding our footing here within Philosophical Friday. So yeah, we touched on is balancing the same as GTO, and we talked about no, it isn't. And then I think the follow-up question to that was where does GTO come from? Like the poker gods, did they hand this to us? Like, what is going on there when we see some kind of GTO output and all of these crazy different frequencies for each combo and that sort of thing? Yeah,
absolutely. So the short answer is sort of, meaning that, and we talked a little bit about that in the podcast about how, and I'm not going to go into the details, how John Nash came with the idea that he told us that there is such thing as GTO in every game where certain assumptions are true, and definitely they are true in poker. But what he didn't tell us is how to find it. This is what is known as existential theorem. He told us it exists somewhere. Yeah. I'm not going to give you the algorithm. And it turns out that algorithmically speaking, this is one of the hardest problems. So for those of you interested in complexity, it's PPAD, which is we're not going to go into the details. It's almost like NP complete, if it could be characterized as NP complete for the computer science nerds. I'm not going to go into details, but sometimes he didn't tell us how to find it. So sometimes, but he told us if somebody gave it to you, you can actually test whether that strategy is GTO. So it's not like it's hidden necessarily in some mystical way. It's just that it's like it's among a million different keys. So the key is there. So if you grab the correct key, you will be able to open the door. You just don't know out of the million keys which one is the one that opens the door. So we start with that. So for all intents and purposes, is godsend, right? In some sense that we don't have a way to find it. So what people are doing, and that's how the solvers actually essentially work. So solvers actually simplify the problem so that they can find a solution. So instead of looking into, again, I'm oversimplifying, instead of looking into 1 billion keys, they sort of like, in some sense, they group the keys together. So they group them in groups of 1,000. So they now treat like 1,000 keys as a single key. So they sort of like, reduce the problem by making it a little bit rough around the edges, so to speak, in order to find it sort of like an approximate solution. So that's kind of like the solution works. So they're not going to go and tell you, here is the key. They're going to tell you your key is somewhere around those 1,000 keys, something like that. So there is an approximation.
And how do you test the key itself?
That's an excellent question. Yes, this is an excellent question. So essentially, to be a little bit more precise with my metaphor, you're not going to just like take 1,000 keys. You're just going to take one out of those 1,000 keys, let's say from the group, and then out of those, let's call them representative keys, right? So you're not necessarily solving the problem out of the entire space of keys. You're solving the problem out of the representative keys.
Yeah. So time out. Let me ask another question.
Yes.
When you say the problem, how do we define what the problem is?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. So the problem, fortunately for us, is somewhat well defined. It is well defined in a probabilistic manner. That is, machines can actually play million hands with themselves, right? So when they have a strategy, they can test that strategy by playing billions of times against each other and then keeping score. If the score is positive, then we call that a victory. If the score is negative, we call that a loss. So the problem is, even though it's not well defined in a single hand, is well defined probabilistically. And that was the key idea of Nash. The key idea of Nash is that we can talk about an entire probabilistic setting, from choosing the strategy all the way to how we evaluate the game itself by just repeating it over and over. So there's like a huge probabilistic setting there.
Yeah, and there's a dependency too on the inputs, right? That you
correct, and we'll get to that.
Solver. Yeah.
Correct. Yes. So the inputs are incredibly important, right? But what we're doing, because here's another thing, right? For instance, in the theoretical setting of Nash tells you that there is an optimal strategy, but when you consider the full spectrum, and I mean literally the full spectrum of likelihoods, right? The full spectrum of how often you're going to play X hand versus Y hand, and also the full spectrum of bet sizes. That means it considers the entire spectrum, specifically when you bet like a 1.32576 big blinds, which obviously you cannot do in every game, right? I mean, you cannot play 1.2, like you can only do increments of 1. So immediately we're losing some information. That's what the metaphor, you're taking 1,000 keys and you represent it with 1 is supposed to mean, right? I mean, you take all of the bet sizes from, let's say, all the way from 1 all the way to 1.49999999999, and you call that one big blind. And then you take all the bet sizes from, let's say, 1.5 all the way to 2.4999, and you call that 2. So the 2 blinds is going to be your key that represents all the other keys in between. And similarly, you take a percentage like, let's say, 70%, and 70% is meant to represent all the percentages somewhere between, let's say, 69 and 71 or something like that. So that immediately shrinks down your problem down to fewer instances, because you don't consider all the all the possibilities. And of course, I'm oversimplifying because computers, especially with percentages, computers can go deeper. Like, even though they cannot split big blinds, they can split percentages. But even computers have to at some point draw a line. They cannot go like all the way to like a trillion decimal places, because if they go to trillion decimal places, the problem becomes incredibly complex for them to solve. So at some point they will also stop, but I'm simplifying.
Because so, like within 1 and 2, there are an infinite number of numbers, right? Like
exactly. No, exactly. And what does that mean for us? Like, are we going to have to look at infinitely many places? Well, Nash tells you yes. If you really want to find the proper GTO, you have to look at infinite number of places. And some of these places, like you may not be able to find, it's just given that there's exactly infinitely many.
So immediately we're screwed.
Exactly. So for the perfect solution, we're screwed. So now comes the question that you ask: what is the input? Now, where do we make the cut? That's one question. And what are the inputs? Because again, another way to simplify, which is how a lot of the modern solvers work, is by assigning a range, right? So usually we assign a range. That is already I want to call it a violation of the freedom that the assumptions require, right? I mean, we need to have perfect freedom. So the opponent can have any range to start with. Of course, if we allow the opponent to have any range, then the game will become exponentially hard to solve. So we make some assumptions, and already that's some sort of like a sacrifice. That being said, and this is the important part, the game can be optimal after a certain point. For instance, in a lot of situations, poker becomes rock, paper, scissors, right? Let's say that you're in the river and your opponent either goes all in or they check. That's actually a problem that can actually be very easy to solve, because there's only two realistic scenarios that they're doing there. Either they go all in or they check. So the game becomes very much like rock, paper, scissors. So from that point on, and I mean literally starting at that point, like starting on the river, the game can be solved.
Sure. And
does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And moving backward, you increase the complexity just exponentially, sort of at each different phase of the game. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Correct. So when we're putting a range to our opponent, we're saying we're not solving the game. We're solving the game after our opponent has been assigned that range.
Sure.
So we're solving it after, and that of course
we're kind of changing the problem, right?
Changing the problem. Correct.
Yeah, correct. We're changing the problem to something more manageable, I guess. Okay, so you go on.
Exactly. No, that's it. No, that's perfect. No, that's exactly right. I mean, and I love interruptions, right? I mean, that's the only way we engage actually in the conversation. So I tell my students all the time: please interrupt me. It's important.
It's a skill I've developed through podcasting and having people on, where it's like, oh, there's something interesting there. I need to interrupt them and ask about that, because if I don't, it goes away right straight out of my brain, and we never circle back to it.
Exactly. No, I agree 100%. So that's a lot of nuance that goes into the solvers. And I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, I haven't looked at the source code, so I'm not exactly 100% exactly what is going on into the algorithm. I would be very interested if, like a computer engineer, let us know at some point exactly what goes into those solvers without obviously violating their NDA agreements and things like that. Whatever they can tell us, I would be very interested in knowing exactly what kind of assumptions. I know already they have to make assumptions, right? I mean, they have to make simplifications, approximations. I just don't know exactly what kind of approximations go into it. I'm sort of like guessing.
That's another interesting part of it too, is like, because obviously that information is proprietary to them, but also from the user perspective, we're kind of trusting the output without really knowing what's going into creating that output, which you can see the potential for bad things happening just starting from that perspective.
That's exactly correct. Yes. And something that you may find interesting, and let us know also in the comments if you also, the listener, you find that interesting. We'll occasionally want to talk about some of the polls that we ask our audiences. And I had that poll on Twitter. Do you believe you truly understand how solvers work? And the answers were yes, the moving pieces, honestly, not really. And about 90% said honestly, not really.
Yeah.
And I will count myself into that category, right? Because again, unless I see the source code, I don't know exactly what approximations are being made, and I find them very relevant. Do the results surprise you in any way, Brad? 90-10, small sample, but
No, they don't really surprise me. I think that poker players and the people to respond to your poll are probably higher level, and I think that on the opposite side of Dunning-Kruger is basically the more you know about poker, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And from that sense, I think there's just a high level of self-awareness for those kind of human beings to recognize that they don't actually know kind of what's going on. If they think about the question, they meditate on the question, they invest some cognitive energy in thinking about it. I have ideas and theories about how the solver works. It's something that actually matters quite a bit in the training space, to me specifically, because, ultimately the ultimate place that you want to be as a poker player would be, being a human solver who's solving these problems kind of in real time. And to be a human solver, you kind of need to understand at least the variables that it's taking into consideration and what's actually going on without knowing exactly what's going on. Maybe one day down the road for some fun project, we can try to make our own solver, just to kind of see what the outputs are. And I think actually that's probably a pretty good way to better understand what's going on in the solver, is to try to figure out and make your own. Because I guess ultimately there are only a number of variables that it can be considering. And so from that perspective, it is something that I think, can be engineered.
Correct. You're absolutely correct. And if I remember correctly, there was actually, I think it was Will Tipton that he mentioned that in his book about Up No Limit. There was a software I played with several years ago. I do not remember the name on top of my head. I can probably find it in my notes, but it was exactly what you basically describing. You're basically going through the tree and you create essentially a mini GTO strategy for specific situations. I mean, usually you start from the turn all the way to the river, but it would be very interesting. It's actually very interesting to see what happens when you do that. And also, Bill Chen did that in the Mathematics of Poker when he was playing the famous ace king queen game, where there's only ace in the deck, a king in the deck, and a queen in the deck, and there's two players, and you get two out of these three cards. Each player gets one. The highest card wins, and there's only one round of betting. And he obviously solved that game perfectly. So people have tried to do similar things, either with toy examples or with shorter versions, not what the computers are doing today, which are much more.
And I want to be clear too. I think there is value. So interestingly, as it relates to solvers producing solutions, even if the solutions are not perfect, I think there is value in producing the solutions, and there is value in going through the process of creating the software and getting feedback and then iterating over time, because that's really how you make a thing better, is by getting data and getting feedback and then iterating. So even if solvers are released that aren't perfect, I think that's still okay if the end goal is to iterate and improve at each kind of stage of the process. So I don't want to think people I'm calling out any solver company for releasing a crappy product or whatever it is, because you got to start somewhere. And just I've learned that starting somewhere and then going from there is oftentimes the best place to it's often the best way to come to some sort of conclusion, or get a little bit closer to, we'll use a word that we started out the show, the truth of the matter.
No, with capital T.
The baby,
the personal, the baby
little,
one, yeah.
the baby truth.
We'll definitely get to that, yeah. And I agree 100%. And just for the record, I just want to say that I also polled recently people on Twitter, and today's solvers. The question was, or more like a statement, true or false statement: today's solvers are theoretically exploitable, say by a future more refined solver. And about 77% said that's a true statement versus a false statement. To which I agree. I mean, again, we know from the math of it. I mean, I just happen to know that because it's my field. We know that there's no way we can actually get to the real answer. So whatever we get is definitely an approximation. So every time we have an approximation, there's no reason to believe that somebody else won't come with a better approximation.
And a more practical question is, or thought is like, will any of these strategies actually be like executable ever? Or is it more an exercise of like pitting one solver against another solver, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, well, this is an excellent question. I don't usually do that, but I'm going to try to answer a question with another question. And I'm sure you've been following some of these matches that happen probably like over the summer, some pretty big names battling some other big names, Bill Galfin versus the rest of the world is another example, doing heads-up battles. And solvers came up a lot in situations like that. So like, again, one can say that would probably, if there is like any time where a solver can shine is when you use it against another like excellent player, or world-class player versus a world-class player. To which the question that I have is probably not what you expect. Why would any of these guys accept that challenge?
The heads up challenges themselves?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think it's human beings are drawn to competitions that can prove that one player is superior than another player. And I think it's a quest for prestige. It's a quest for challenging oneself. I just spoke about this when I had Terrence Chan on the podcast from Daniel Negreanu's side of how ultimately the conclusion that I came to as it related to like Daniel accepting the challenge against Doug Polk was, to me, I find it to be a fairly admirable thing to do, because it was testing and it involved a lot of growth that he experienced as a player. I have to imagine that he grew massively through that challenge, just learning about sort of just the new wave of online poker and heads up poker specifically. So like, yeah, I think those are self-improvement, prestige, are ultimately the drivers of accepting those challenges. I don't necessarily think that money is at the top of the list, even though I guess you could make the argument that Doug challenging Daniel, his major reward was financial, whereas I think Daniel's major reward was learning skills and just upgrading his ability to play poker, which over the long run, can be a plus EV investment.
For sure. And to their credit, both players, and I remember in particular, I mean, many people wanted to ask Daniel Negreanu because he went there as the underdog. Why would you do that, right? And his answer was pretty much exactly that. He said, I can afford it, and I think it's an excellent opportunity for me to improve, right? It's an excellent opportunity for me to see what is at the top of today's games and how I can utilize it to add more arrows to my quiver, essentially. So get a better player.
Yeah, and I know this is like we're again straying off the GTO topic here, but I've always been a big fan of trying to learn and reflect on things that happen while you're playing poker, because you can make many mistakes that, if you reflect on them, can make you money over the course of your poker career. And we get so focused in on the short term aspects of poker that we kind of lose sight of the long-term aspects of poker. And I've done like plenty of personal challenges myself, like playing every single hand pre-flop or V-pipping within a certain parameter of rules. And what I find to be quite interesting about those challenges, when you sort of like remove a move from your arsenal and you're forced to play in a certain way that is not intuitive, that you don't have a ton of experience with, you can just learn so many valuable lessons that you can apply to your game holistically, that I think it's something that poker players don't often do enough of, is going through something that, say, costs you $1,000 and reflecting on that situation, extracting the valuable takeaways, and then applying that to your game moving forward can be worth more than $1,000, or much more than $1,000 over the course of your poker career, which is to say that, yeah, you can make money from your mistakes if you are reflecting and thinking about them in that way.
Exactly. The long run versus the short run.
Yeah.
And that also reminds me of Tommy Angelo's approach, right? Where he always says, when you sit at a table, maybe you can focus on one aspect of the game, and today you're gonna be working on that. Like for example, you alluded to, right? I mean, you just pick a thing, and maybe a thing that you haven't been doing before, right? And you just try to try it out. I think combining these two ideas, one can actually improve exactly the same way you go to the gym and you try a new move and see how does that work out. Like maybe it's not good for my body. It puts extra pressure on a very weak spot that I have, or maybe it's good because it puts a lot of pressure on the weak spot that I have. I mean, you don't know exactly how that's going to play out until you try it. So
yeah, always experiment as it relates to poker. Just like always be willing to experiment and understand that through that experimentation, maybe a bad thing happens, but it can be plus EV over the course of your life.
But to answer your question before, because I didn't, I mean, as I was jokingly, like making another question, so the question is, again, so what are the, all of these, again, try to steel man a little bit the argument of the solvers, right? I mean, what are their purposes, a solver versus, like, are they good just a solver versus another solver? I can think of a few things that can be very useful. One, obviously, I mean, the obvious argument, and this argument is not new. That argument came from Bill Chen, like something like 20 years ago, when he was, for all of those who know the stats and they keep records of everything, forgive me for not getting the dates right, but
come after Duncan. Put him in Twitter jail. Yeah.
I welcome that. I tell that to my students all the time,
See if you can find the key to this, Duncan.
That's exactly right. So something like 20 years ago, he was at a final table with some very strong players, like Phil Ivey and the likes. And he said, I mean, I know I'm outclassed, right? So the best I can do is basically lock in some sort of like fair share. That was basically his argument. So I'm going to try to play as close to, again, we didn't have solvers at the time, but I mean, Bill Chen has been looking into game theory optimal almost before anything else. Again, poker historians probably will correct me on that, but that's one of the first people that I knew in the literature working on that stuff.
Yeah, probably working on it before it was even coined as game theory optimal, because I think, didn't the coinage come like in the mid 2000s?
Yeah, I mean, that's already like, mathematicians been using that, but I mean, it's not, officially
as
like
it applied to
poker. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So again, poker historians will know much better. I don't quite have the answers to those things, but the interesting thing that he said, and I believe he mentioned that in an MIT lecture, is that basically his approach was, I want to lock in profits because I'm outclassed. So there is some value, even in many GTO situations, to lock in profits when you think you're outclassed and you cannot leave the table. Like I often usually say that Alex, my heroine from the book, when they ask her, what did you do when everybody at the table is good? What type of GTO strategy do you use? And Alex is like, yeah, I just leave the table. So that's my GTO strategy. Just leave the table, and or if she's practicing, she stays there to practice. But if she's trying to make money, she just leaves the table. And so if you cannot leave the table, GTO can be very useful. That's one way to look at things. Another thing is that it is sometimes useful outside of the table, not real time, to sort of know what does the approximation to GTO, because that's what we have, tell us about what the fair price is. Because that actually gives us a perspective, right? I mean, for example, if the GTO is telling us that the fair price is about, like, let's say $3, and we're trying to shoot for $9, we might be a little bit way too off, right? I mean, the risk that we're taking might be a little bit higher than we are anticipating. So the GTO can actually tell us exactly what the fair price is in situations like that. And I think the example that many people were surprised by is that how most solvers that were playing monotone boards, namely making smaller bets. Like most people thought the correct strategy was like bet big because, again, we want to charge our opponents. But it turns out that the machines realize that, again, the risk reward is more suitable to smaller bets. And something like that, even if our frequencies are not optimal when we're betting boards like this, we can still learn from that and make closer to proper sizes. We can learn sizes, we can learn things like that, that although they're not going to make us GTO players, at least they're going to give us a feel, that can give us a sense of what works and what doesn't in certain spots.
Awesome. So, yeah. So yeah, it's looking at what the solvers are like recommending for sizings specifically, some sort of baseline foundational map that
Mhm.
that you can use. Now, a follow-up question here is, can the game be beaten without solvers? Is poker a winnable game if you're not using solvers? I think
Why don't
everybody
we ask
probably knows
Twitter
my
about
answer.
this?
Yeah, what does Twitter say?
So let's see what Twitter said about this. I think I should change my handle to the MathDR asks versus ask the MathDR, because I'm asking more questions than I have answers to.
Yeah.
But this is one poll that I did back in June, and actually that got a decent sample. I always compare it to my audience, of course. And the question was, do you think the game can still be beaten on feel alone? So that was the question. It was a simple yes or no question. Brad, what do you think the response was?
The response. So now this is like a sort of like a meta question.
Meta question. What do you think of the population? What do you think the population thinks about that?
I don't know. I don't know the answer. You know, I'm not confident either way.
Okay.
I
So you can
I
see it go both ways.
suspect I can see it go both ways. I suspect the answer, the feedback would be yes, but again, I'm not sure.
Yes, I actually thought that many people would say no. I thought that the no would win, but you're actually correct. The yes did win by a small margin, 53% to 47%. So it's
There you go. I'm on the fence because it's so close.
It's very close. It's that's correct. So it's very, very, very close. So people are indeed torn about this. At least I should say, people who follow me, that is, and there's always bias. But I think it shows us that a lot of people think that's possible. But it's also interesting to see that a lot of people think that that's not possible, right? And let's start with that. What do you think? Why do you think people who said no, and why do you think who people said yes? Like, what do you think they're seeing? Such both sides of the argument.
I think wow. So as somebody that's like firmly in the yes camp, I would say the yes people
try to answer the no if you're in the yes camp. It makes it
try to answer the no. It's either I guess two segments. One would be people who are not people who are, for lack of a better word, they're just undereducated on what solvers are and sort of see them as like, the poker god. I think there's that camp, and then there's probably another camp of math inclined human beings that are quite analytical, who have used solvers specifically to beat the game and cannot beat the game without solver existing. So I would say those are probably the two camps, and probably the two perspectives that are say no. Just a human being that, like, for whatever reason, could not beat poker, or struggled to beat poker, or had a low win rate, and then invested in solvers, and then over time saw their win rate go up. So they got feedback that said like, oh, wow, this thing has like really elevated my game. Therefore, because we're human beings, again, working on a sample size of one, our own life experience leads them to say, yeah, you can't beat poker because you can't beat poker without a solver just because I couldn't do it.
That makes sense. How about the yes camp?
I think the yes camp is pretty simple. It's somebody that has beaten poker over time without using a solver, because they are exactly an example of the fact that the game can be beaten without using solvers. And also too, I would say that like the yes camp is much easier to defend, because all it takes is one person doing it to defend it.
So since I'm also on the yes camp, for basically the same reasons you just described, and let me just try to also steelman a little bit the no camp to the best of my abilities, and try to paint them in a better color if possible. And again, that's difficult, but I'm going to do my best. Like, one of the reasons I could see somebody saying no, which is very similar to basically what you said, is that they're playing at incredibly difficult games. So not necessarily trying GTO, but like just being on really difficult games, like being on a difficult game that you cannot win, being outclassed, or being at a similar level as your opponents. Because again, poker is not a plus EV game. Poker is a negative EV game as a whole, right? I mean, negative sum is what mathematicians are calling it, like, which means money is taken out in the form of rake. So all players being equal, everybody loses money at the table. So maybe they cannot beat the rake. Maybe nobody at their table does, because they are of similar skill level.
What's interesting is that it's such a difficult thing to prove by virtue of needing a massive sample size against the
Correct.
same configuration of players
Correct.
over time.
Correct.
You know?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And this is, incidentally, Brad, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because again, people who understand randomness, and I would say, again, I'm bringing Taleb as an example here because I consider him one of the most credible critics of the way sometimes mathematics is applied math is applied to the world, is exactly that, a critique on how one should be very, very careful making inferences from what is actually small samples, or be very, very careful finding patterns where none exist. So we have to be incredibly, incredibly careful. And of course, I mean, his arguments go and say that what you guys think they're normally distributed, like basically nice and curvy, and most population in the middle, and then very few people are outliers, doesn't apply to everything. Like, for example, doesn't apply to wealth. Wealth is not very nicely distributed. It's like you have complete outliers that shift the averages, and that's why people are using median instead of, anyway. Like, his point is that we have to be careful, and I totally agree. Like, we have to be incredibly careful when we're making inferences. But the point here also, that the games can be very difficult, is something that can twist somebody's judgment. Because if you're playing against, like, if you're sitting at a nine-handed table and you play against 8 better players, I mean, feel is not going to help you. That's for sure, right? Because again, they're better.
We'd have to go down the rabbit hole of like what is
Right.
feel and intuition, which is like its own separate conversation, I think.
Yeah, actually, yeah. Let's add that as a topic if anybody's interested, because that would be an interesting topic.
Well, I'm interested, so there you go.
I am too. I am too, but I'm not
That's
gonna
all.
lie to
That's
you.
all we need, Duncan. Just me and you. That's what matters most.
So for those of you who are still wondering why this, conversation started, that's exactly how it started. We run out of all those tangents all the time, so we decided, what, maybe some of that stuff might be useful.
Sure.
But Brad, I do have another poll, because that's all I do in my spare time.
Mm-hmm.
I have another poll as it relates to difficult games, and you mentioned that a little bit earlier. You mentioned cheating online, but I was mostly interested in the form of RTAs, real-time assistants. And the question was, are you comfortable playing online with the existence of RTAs, real-time assistant technology? So are you comfortable playing online with the existence of essentially, GTO technology?
To answer the question, no, I'm not comfortable. And I guess there are a lot of other follow-up questions that kind of stem from that. Is that uncomfortability enough to not play online? I think is probably the follow-up there. And the answer to that is I'm also not so uncomfortable that I'm unwilling to play online, even knowing full well that such things do exist.
Mm-hmm. Very good. That makes sense to me. Yes. And what would you guess the distribution on that one was? It was a yes or no question, smallish sample.
I would say mostly. Oh man. So actually, let me just give a percentage here, because I think that's maybe a better way to do it. So distribution, probably 83% uncomfortable.
Yeah. Again, that's what I was expecting too. And again, it could be a lot of noise, and it's also a small sample. So this one specifically came 50-50. It's only 16 votes, so it's like it's a small one. Yeah, that one came more like in the middle. So some people are still, and again, I mean, one can speculate. If you are playing online, I mean, again, it's difficult to answer. No, because again, I mean, you're playing online and you just don't want to feel bad for yourself. I mean, again, humans, we tend to be biased in so many ways. So, but yeah, that's the reason why I mentioned this poll, is because I think it's related to that question. Like if people are perhaps in difficult games, then they start thinking, what, maybe GTO is my way out, or if you will, non-GTO methods like feel or intuition and things like that are not going to be enough for me to help me with the game.
I mean, one thing that jumps sort of I take some solace in is that, like, because the win rates aren't going to be massive by
Mhm.
deploying said strategy, the variance will be quite high as well. And when you're talking about just, some random human off the street that's like, oh, let me see this thing and fire it up and start like following the map that's getting created in front of your eyes, there's still going to be a lot of variance, and human bias will still come into play, and like risk tolerance, risk aversion, all of these things will still factor in. So at least that's happening. Um, and hopefully the online poker platforms, the security departments, all of that stuff, they are taking some sort of measures to track and filter out real-time assistance throughout, however they create their protocols. I would say that's probably one of the major priorities, or maybe the major priority of all online poker platforms, is in recognizing that someone is using real-time assistance and then getting them out of the pool as quickly as possible and not letting them back in the pool, right? I think because it could be something along the lines of an existential crisis of online poker kind of disappearing. And I would say that there's, billions of reasons why the powers that be don't want that to happen. And so they're properly incentivized to tackle the problem. And, I happen to know some people who are running platforms, and I happen to know people who are thinking about these problems at a very high level. And so I don't know that there will be a perfect solution, but I do know that there are problems that are being actively thought about,
Mhm.
and measures are being taken to um, eliminate real-time assistance as much as possible.
Yeah, that's always good to hear, and that actually brings us to one of the questions that we wanted to ask in the end. Are online games compromised? And I just want to add to that some personal experience. I used to play online. I no longer do that. I no longer play online heads up. I used to play a lot. I've played against a lot of bots. I have to say, like it's clear, there's certain. I mean, again, poker players who play a lot, when somebody is like always there at all times, it doesn't matter, like when as is a bot, like never till then you go to their database and they literally have the same like bluffing hands, like they have like the bluffing like 7-4 suited, like as as the the 4-bet bluffs or what have you. So there are ways for people to know about over long samples. I mean, we're talking about like I guess some of these guys I had like close to like 20,000 hands. So
Right. And this was
yeah, so
limited data points, and
of
the poker
course,
platforms themselves can have many more data points
correct,
like that they collect over time to analyze and give them feedback much more quickly than, we could as humans.
correct. But just I just want to put that little anecdotal aside. What is your verdict? What is your take? Like, are online games today compromised?
It really depends on how the definition of the
Nation
word
of, I love it.
compromise,
Yeah,
right?
that's what we're here. That's what we call philosophy.
I mean, I think the answer is undeniably yes.
Mhm.
Through and
How
then
would you define compromised?
right. So if it's anything, like basically anything that's not available to everyone, like at the same time, I would say that's like would be my definition of like, in live poker, it's very clear what's happening, right? It's me versus you. I have my wits, my brain, the chips in front of me, and we're collecting data points and making decisions. And
And I
so,
have my hair. So you have your wits, I have
yeah,
my hair, we're battling it out.
exactly. We're battling it out, right? And we could go on like the ethical rabbit hole of like HUDs and or HUDs heads up displays, as well as like real time assistance and all of these sort of things. But like to me, if the game is compromised when players are using something that not everybody has access to in the moment while they're playing the game, in that way, I guess, yeah, the games have to be compromised, right? Because people are using pre-flop charts. These are like accepted ways.
Mhm.
Again, I don't know where the committee is that determines whether a thing is like ethically acceptable or unacceptable. But before the Doug Polk and Negreanu thing, I didn't think that like using pre-flop charts was like acceptable. But this is just based on my judgment as a human being
Mhm.
while playing poker. But I learned through that it was like amongst high level heads up players, it's like generally accepted that people use these charts. So anyway, I guess I guess in that way, like the games have to be compromised, right? It's just at what level are they compromised, and what kind of edge are the tools that compromise the game giving the other players. And again, it's really hard to say. I know this is like, I guess maybe this is a perfect title for this show is philosophical Fridays, because like it's none of these this question seems like it's easy to answer,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
it's not really easy to answer. But yes, I would say they are compromised. And it's just from there, it's just figuring out like at what level they're compromised and at what level is like an acceptable comp I don't even know the right word to you. At what level is it acceptable that the games are compromised?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think I usually say that the definition of misunderstanding, that was a realization. Okay, it came to me when I was a teenager. Like you have all of this teenage drama, right? And it's like, why is everybody fighting everybody? So I was trying to make sense of the world, and one of the definitions of misunderstanding I gave is that if you have Alex and Bob, Alex does something to Bob that Bob finds kind of offensive in some way, but he doesn't say anything. So Alex doesn't think she did anything because Bob didn't say anything. Now Bob, retaliates and does something to Alex. Alex is like, "Hey, you started it." Bob is like, "No, you started it." And then all of a sudden, we have that misunderstanding. Again, it sounds exactly like teenage drama, right? That's because where it originated. But I mean, that idea of teenage drama, if you think about it, applies to the conversations. Like, how many times have we seen people fighting? Oh, there's too many bots, or there's not enough bots, or it's like, I mean, nobody say there's. I mean, people who own the websites will say there's not enough bots, and then people are fighting. HUD should be allowed, HUD should not be allowed, and I think the reason why it's because people are making different assumptions. Like most of the disagreements start because people start exactly like, what do we define as compromised? What is right and what isn't right? And I think it is very important now more than ever, and not just in places like Twitter, to have conversations, like having conversations which can be more than 140 characters, because we have to define words like that. What does it mean to be compromised, and how willing is the player pool to withstand some of these restrictions or not restrictions, and then how people feel comfortable. We don't necessarily, some people will argue otherwise. Some people say that we need government regulation. We don't need government regulation. We don't necessarily need a government regulation, but we need some sort of like regulation. The question is, well, how will that regulation happen? Will it happen from within? Will it happen from the players essentially pushing for that? Because the players also have a lot of power. The players are the customers, right? So if the players are complaining and they sit out of those games, the companies have to make adjustments. So I think these are important conversations, and people, players in particular, should vote with their actions. And I know that because, again, I've been very vocal about that. I've written articles and I've contacted, to their credit, I mean, I have contacted ACR before about an issue that I found with Reka in Heads Up Games, and we had like a very big discussion, which then later became public. And it was, I don't know if you know about that, but there's like been an article. They actually changed the entire rake structure. We had a conversation with their CEO, Phil Nagy, and I know to some people he's a controversial figure, but to his credit, he spoke to me on the phone. I gave him the data. We had a conversation. He changed the rake structure because I told him that it's unsustainable for certain stakes. And I think conversations like that, like players should have these conversations either with other players or with the powers that be. I don't know what
Yeah.
you think about that.
Well, I mean, I guess from there, I give credit to Phil Nagy for changing his stance when he's given extra information. I think that's always a sign of somebody that like just somebody who's open to analyzing and solving problems that they may not have seen before. So I would say that a lot of the rules, and one issue that I have is a lot of the rules given that poker platforms use are created by non-poker players
Mhm.
or non-high level poker players that like seem from a business perspective like a great idea, but in practice are just really awful. That I think is what leads to like a lot of problems where, they're not forming some sort of committee of like respectable high level poker players to give feedback on whatever it is that they're trying to do. I mean, we had this whole thing years back, the whole, fuck the pros sort of mantra. I've had discussions with people who are heads of poker platforms who have, basically told me kind of straight to my face, like, oh, we don't actually want players like you playing on the platform. We're targeting like the recreational players. We're not targeting high level players that like actually play poker for a living and will take money out of the player pool, which that to me just shows sort of a lack of understanding of the ecosystem and how poker works and the drivers behind even beginning to play poker in the first place. So yeah, I think that like some sort of committee of trusted people, if you're a poker platform, to ask them these questions and like have conversations and discussions about the best way to solve these types of problems and to better understand what's going on. Because when you're in something, it's a lot different than when you're outside of it, kind of looking at it. So yeah, I guess I don't even remember the question. I've been talking so long at this point.
No. That's spot on, right? I mean, again, the idea is that if discussions are the way to go. Basically, we started our online games compromise, right? And how essentially can this be resolved? And I was asking you, do you think that having these discussions are important? And you raised a very important point that people from the inside need to also be poker players, which again, if you think about it, that's a similar point to when people are discussing politics. Sometimes, what some people will tell you is that the lawmakers are predominantly lawyers. So that means they're not necessarily representing the population equally. You don't have many engineers, you don't have many scientists, you don't have many workers there, so that they can necessarily express their point of view, which is very similar.
Right. If we look at like the National Football League, right, they have a rules committee that is comprised of like current and former coaches and players and like human beings who have lived within those rules over time. And I do want to make one thing clear here. I do believe fundamentally that the platform is ultimately responsible for everything that happens within their own ecosystem. And so if there is real-time assistance, it is on the platform to begin to solve that problem, right? Like grimming was a big deal years back. I'm sure you playing lots of heads up poker are familiar with, somebody basically paying their small blind and then leaving before they pay their big blind. And if you do this enough times over the course of a year, it adds up to quite a substantial amount of money.
Absolutely.
And a lot of the platforms will say like, we're trying to get rid of predatory behavior. Well, it's on you to do a better job of not letting predatory behavior be an option for the players in the first place, right? It's a process problem, and the players are not, we're there to play poker. And when you set up loopholes, the players will take advantage of it. I promise you, no matter what the loophole is. And so it's on you to solve these problems, and not to create some sort of like list from on high of commandments to follow when you play on their platform. Just don't let us have that as an option. And the experience is just much better over time.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason why I'm smiling, by the way, is because again, you say loopholes, and all I'm thinking is that this situation is perfectly analogous to Congress and the lawmakers, right? I mean, if you create loopholes, or if you allow for loopholes, let's say in the taxation system, people would take advantage of it, right? It's exactly the same idea.
Of course they
right?
will. Yeah,
of course they will. And there, and there's so one thing again, because again we're calling it the philosophy podcast, and we want to take both sides of the argument, right?
Sure.
So would you mind if I
yeah,
take
go
the
for
other
it.
side
Go
of
for it.
Yeah. So we're calling it steel manning, and that's the opposite of straw manning. You straw man an argument, you make it look like essentially a scarecrow, and then the opposite of that, you make it like out of steel. The one thing that I would say is that history has shown us that the over representation of poker players can be a bad thing, right? And immediately the Full Tilt scandal comes to mind. This was an example where people who shouldn't have been anywhere near business. That were basically handling millions of dollars of poker players, and there might be like some younger audiences here that actually they don't know exactly what happened, and just very quickly, to anybody who may not know what happened, essentially they did not keep segregated accounts for players' money. So essentially they were using players' money as if they belonged to the company, and they used that money as they saw fit. They paid bonuses, they did things, and their accounting was basically completely screwed up. That's kind of like a simplified version of it. Again, we're not, if you really want to find what happened, I mean, we highly recommend like consulting a historian. But I know much about this because I lost money in that situation until they were taken over later, and we got our money back 2.5 years later. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the representation is a real issue. Like we can, the same way a committee can be underrepresented, it could also be overrepresented.
Sure,
By
absolutely.
yeah, and
Eh,
it will be an interesting. And of course, the other joke is it's easier to say what shouldn't be done versus to find exactly what has to be
to
done,
do,
right? Because
yeah,
essentially, I'm just like I'm not offering a solution by saying that we shouldn't put like too many poker players. The question is, what should we do? That's the
right.
real question.
Well,
And
not let poker players run all of the details of the business. Let people who are specifically designed to do such a thing, I mean, have specific experience, run the business side and the accounting side and that sort of thing, and let the poker players worry about the actual game itself
right,
functionally and all the the innovative side of poker. Because like really, the downside is very clear in full tilt, right? The full tilt
mhm,
just example. But the upside was that Full Tilt was innovating in a way that no
right,
other poker platform was. It was by far the best software on the market. They were,
right, right,
we would, Stars wouldn't have Zoom Poker if it weren't for Full Tilt,
right.
inventing Rush Poker. Like,
Very
so
good.
they were super innovative. And that was because a lot of their software decisions were created by poker players who understood what was going on and saw the possibilities, which is a great thing. Unfortunately, the downside of that was that those same poker players were also responsible for managing money and accounting
Right,
and not doing what they did, which is not keeping all the money in escrow from all the player balances and just kind
right.
of like dipping their fingers into it, which yeah, it's obviously horrendous and a terrible thing. So to me, the answer would be somewhere in the middle of having specific processes that are set up and ran by human beings who have experience and are qualified to run such processes, and then not letting them kind of mix.
Absolutely. And to add to that, like something that I would consider as a proposal, or like a proposed solution, if you call it, as opposed to just what doesn't work, would be you're absolutely correct, by the way. Like that's exactly what happened with Full Tilt. Was innovative in many aspects, and we need that. But at the same time, we need a company like that to fail and to have consequences if they fail in any of the other important aspects, like for example paying people money. So, and usually in situations like that, the one solution would be to allow for more companies to emerge, which becomes very difficult when, at the very least, playing online is a gray zone at this point, right? I mean,
Yeah.
some people will call it flat out illegal. Some people will say, well, I mean, it depends. It's a game of skill, and maybe that's a topic of another discussion. Is playing online legal or illegal? Maybe we can have some legal experts.
Yeah, we need a legal expert for that because I'm certainly not the human to talk to about that.
Absolutely not. Me neither. So, but the point that I'm trying to make is that because again, usually I'm not personal, and again, now that's totally my personal opinion. I'm not steel manning or straw manning anything. My personal opinion, I find it very difficult the bottom up, the top down approaches where we're saying, oh, basically the idea that Plato did back in the day, where he tried to say, okay, these type of people with the golden blood, as he was calling it, the philosophers will going to be the ones who are going to be responsible for the laws. They're not going to get paid. And then these type of people, the silver bloods, they're going to be the soldiers. And then these people, the bronze bloods, they're going to be, in his Republic. I'm not a big fan of, even though like people like Plato, who are like insanely, ahead of their time, I still think it's very dangerous for like one human or several humans to make decisions kind of like a priori, like kind of like theorizing how the world would work. Actually, the work itself sometimes tells us what the answers are just by letting it act out. So if we had more companies, again, fighting each other out, and then usually the good ideas rise to the top and the bad ideas get demolished. So
Yeah.
some sort of like a proxy of a solution, and again, personal opinion, personal approach, would be to encourage more websites, because what happens again when monopolies emerge, either naturally or artificially, they're going to do whatever they want. And then we saw that with PokerStars, for example, right? I mean, the rake structure, there's not much competition, for better or worse. Like, I'm not judging either way, but like if you have multiple companies fighting against each other, then
Yeah, and so that sort of ties into like, the barrier to entry in the US market, like over time doesn't need to be like just overly restrictive. Just because we do need innovation and competition, like that ultimately is a good thing. I think it's better for the players. It's probably not as good for the companies themselves, but it's better for the players and just, I think, poker in general. I do think it's quite interesting, philosophically speaking, how after the full tilt debacle, how a lot of the companies in place sort of extracted kind of weird lessons. Like, fuck the pros was one of those lessons, which was quite interesting because, like, for somebody that lived through the rise of Full Tilt, it wasn't a major platform, and then it was. It was like a minor thing that gained a lot of traction through their marketing campaigns,
right.
through, just like play with the pros, right? Like that,
pros, right.
that slogan.
Which was true, by the way. That's another thing which is funny. Like, you could actually play with the pros. Like,
absolutely.
they were there. Yeah, they were there. It wasn't a fake advertising that sometimes. And this comes from somebody who's been hurt tremendously by that company. So I'm just trying to be honest. Yeah.
And it allowed them to capture a lot of market share over a small period of time. And people loved it. Like, the players loved. There's a reason why so many people played on Full Tilt. There's a reason why so many people are to this day very angry at Howard Lederer and the gang. And that's because Full Tilt, while they hurt a bunch of people, they also hurt them in a way of like, we trusted you, we believed in you, and you were like representing us, and you totally fucked us. And that is where a lot of that hurt, I believe, stems from. But the positive lesson from that was they built a brand that was massive and gained a lot of market share in a highly competitive environment where there were tons of different options to play poker. And so, like, that's why it's so like confusing how that message kind of over time, once there were different powers at Stars, kind of changed and started going the other way, being like antagonistic towards the professional poker players. That's kind of like confusing to me. So yeah, I think that, I don't know. I just think that, like, we should take the positive lessons and take the negative lessons and do what we can with both sides of it, because there was, in Full Tilt's defense, a lot of good things that they did, and then they did a very horrible thing as well that we also have to take into account.
And this is actually a very interesting topic to me, because I've thought about that a lot, and it ties to accountability. It ties to I know we started with GTO, but like, as you can see, all of these things are so connected, right? So it ties to accountability, responsibility, and then questions like, should we forgive, as a community, certain things, and what does forgive even mean? Like, is it or should people, still have to pay the consequences of their actions detached from any emotion? I mean, you messed up, you just have to pay the consequences. That's how life works. Or, we just have to kind of like forget and move on. And then again, like, these are questions which, a lot of some people are thinking about, a lot of people don't care about. I mean, these are some questions which, could be interesting to potentially explore, because it kind of like shows us, again, potentially it could be tied to forgiveness of ourselves when we make mistakes at the poker table, right? And again, what does that mean? Like, is forgiveness forgetfulness? Like all of these things which are tied together. I personally find them very interesting questions. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I do. And to like tie it back into the thread of like
Right.
GTO here before we, close down this conversation, I think you could tie it back in by saying that like, Full Tilt took a massive risk.
Right.
And as a company, whoever was in charge of those decisions took a massive risk that did not go their way. It went very much not their way. And the people that were in charge of taking that risk, that had a hand in taking that risk, ultimately deal with the consequences. Whether, whoever's opinion is that the consequences are fair or not. There were lives that were ruined, lives that were crushed, most likely. And I don't know this for sure, but some there are most likely some very bad things that occurred because of the actions of
Absolutely.
those specific people. And so there is a large responsibility and burden that, in my opinion, they must bear because that's a consequence of their actions.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I guess I'll leave that judgment up to other people. But for me, if they're a pariah in the poker community, they can't show up without getting booed to a tournament. That's not even like they didn't go to prison. This is like they don't get to do this thing that they love and they enjoy doing. And yet a lot of them still have a bunch of money that they made from the whole thing at the end of the day that kind of sets them up for the rest of their lives. And they don't have to worry about any sort of monetary resources, which was their goal, right? Like that was their driving force. So for me, like, yeah, it was a thing. Mistakes were made, and ultimately as human beings, you have to live with the consequences of those mistakes, whatever they might be. I haven't really seen many articles or anything about anybody just like profusely apologizing or like giving the inside scoop of what went down. I haven't seen any of that from any of the people who were involved. So like, I don't know if that's a thing that like, if that matters to those specific players, then that really they need to take responsibility and come out and put themselves in a public forum and answer these questions. That's really the only way there's like movement. Otherwise it's like, I guess the strategy is just to like hope that over time everybody forgets and they can kind of just like hop back in the poker room without any consequences. And that to me is kind of not very responsible.
Right. No, I agree with you 100%. And actually, I agree with you so much that I'm actually trying to convince myself to take the other argument, right?
Sure.
So I don't jump into that side because again, I've been hurt so much from that website and I have so many things to say. But one thing I'm going to say, like the one thing that I can think of, again, I'm literally trying to find arguments on the other side to Stillman, to keep a balance as much as possible. It's very difficult, very hard, is that I know like I'm almost, I don't know, like I feel it's such a high probability that their lawyers would be all over them. Do not open your mouth. Do not open your mouth. Everything you will say can be used against you. Who knows when? And, even though some of these legal matters have been resolved, again, I'm not a lawyer, but the predominant slogan from lawyers is just keep your mouth shut, keep your mouth shut, keep your mouth shut, which again, I can to some extent understand. But in terms of like accountability, responsibility, and everything you're saying is just, again, is like if you do not want to open your mouth, then maybe the players again don't want to accept you back to the community. Like you just have to. Where it gets complicated is when specific entities are protecting. They have to because they have to protect all the players. So now you have things like in the World Series of Poker. I mean, you will see Chris Ferguson's, being Player of the Year, and then I believe it was, again, historians, please forgive me if I get this wrong, 2017, but it was certainly after 2011, right? You can see his picture right there in was it the Amazon room? I forget which room it is, like Brazil. I forget which one it is. Again, I get all this wrong, so just never quote me on that. But his picture is there, with fanning out his caches. And again, for better or worse, this is just now a face in the poker world. So the question then becomes, if somebody hasn't taken responsibility because again they're following their advice of their lawyers, is it okay to just allow them to go and play? And these are very difficult questions. We're not the judge and the executioner, but I mean, at some point there are some consequences. Again, rationally speaking, not emotionally speaking, are these consequences are being paid? When the brand seems to be alive and kicking. That's some questions I would ask myself. And also, like, if a player feels uncomfortable at the table and say, hey, I don't want to play with this person, I just don't want to sit with that person, then what does that might sound like a crazy request. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it could sound like a crazy request, but it's easy to frame it in a way that would make sense.
Right.
My younger brother jumped off a bridge because of what happened at Full Tilt, and this human across the felt for me right now is one of the people responsible, and I don't want to play with him. Right? Like that's a case that you could see somebody make that I think the floor probably wouldn't do anything, but you can understand it, right? You can understand that perspective. And ultimately it boils down to risk. And, if the lawyers say, don't say anything, and that is what you choose to do because the risk, the downside, is higher than the upside, then you still must live with the consequences because that is your decision to not take that risk. Right. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have. Those are most of my thoughts on Full Tilt, and I don't know how we ended on Full Tilt coming from GTO.
So basically here's the chain of thought, which actually kind of like makes sense, right? I mean, we have game theory optimal, right? The game theory optimal is more risky to online players because game theory optimal is associated with computers. Computers are associated with online play. Online play is associated with potentially games being compromised. And then how do we prevent games from being compromised is by having potentially a balanced board that consists of both poker players and non-poker players. And what happens if we have only poker players? Full Tilt happens. And then what are the ethics? It's all chained, right? I mean, it's not, I mean, somebody might think we're talking out of our butts here, which very well may. I mean, I'm not saying otherwise, it's a podcast about philosophy and poker, probably ruining both, right? I mean, that's essentially what is happening here. But I'm having a lot of fun. I don't know about you.
No, I'm having a great time, and I think originally the idea was like these to be 30-minute pods, but we kind of messed that up in episode 1. So maybe we'll have to invest a little bit more energy in creating like a structure to restrict ourselves. It's like, I think it was Abraham Lincoln, I don't know, just insert some famous president that said, if you need me to do a 10-minute speech, I need you to give me a month. And if you need me to do a 2-hour speech, like, I'm ready to go right now.
Right. Exactly. Cutting stuff out is actually very, very difficult because, again, things like, what do you mean by compromise, right? What do you mean by feel, right? I mean, it's, we're trying to write it down in a tweet form, but again, there's all of that nuance, and correctly so.
Yep. So Duncan, author of Why Alex Beats Bobby at Poker, thank you very much for your time and your energy. And yeah, can't wait to see how this podcast format is received by the community, and hopeful to do many more of these types of episodes with you, sir.
Absolutely, sir. It's been a pleasure. And let me just say that I'm someone who actually kind of likes feedback. So people, the more than
not the polls, right?
Not the polls.
Mr. Poll, yeah.
Mr. Paul Amurdas. Oh, that was too bad. No, so that's not good. No good. My wife makes fun of me and my dad jokes. But the one thing I want to say, like, if people have any, as I usually call it, any objections, questions, or comments, we're more than happy to talk about this. Again, as long as the questions are civil, anything goes. We can always
anything to me. Anything doesn't go. Like anything like semantical. If I like misspoke or something, like, you can just like you can send the questions all you want, but they're not going to get answered.
Okay, that's fine. I personally don't mind. I encourage that stuff. It's just it's just me. I'm weird like that. But yes, but again, as long as it's civil, because that's it's easier that way to have a conversation. Some of these topics are necessary. I mean, by accident, sometimes they can be a little bit controversial. So, we're not trying to offend anybody, but at the same time, we have to speak our minds, right? I mean, we can't, just hold our thoughts.
Yeah, we feel the way we feel.
We feel the way we feel, exactly.
Yeah. So with that said, man, we'll shut it down and we'll see you
Absolutely.
next time.
See you on the next one. Take care, man.